I think I'll make use of this natural quieting down. That means I don't have to try to get people to be quiet. Ladies and gentlemen, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Kjersti Börjes, and I'm the Master of St. Catherine's College. I'd like to welcome you to St. Catherine's College for this inaugural. That's indeed what I would like to do. However, because of our reinforced autoclave aerated concrete issues, we all know them as RAC, but some of us have learned the full wording for them. We will not be able to be in the Bernard Sunday Lectures Theatre in the college, which is where we would normally hold this event. So I'm very pleased that we found this lovely venue instead. And I'd like to welcome you to the Blavatnik School for the inaugural of the Cameron Mackintosh Visiting Professor of Contemporary Theatre 2023 to 24, Greg Doran. And I also want to welcome all those who are joining us online to this event. Sir Cameron recalls in a book about the college, when in 1988 I was first asked by the then Vice-Chancellor of Oxford to have lunch with him. I thought it was a joke by one of my more misguided friends. However, it was a genuine request. So, curious to find out what on earth such a lofty academic wished to ask me, I discovered that the university wanted me to consider setting up a chair in drama in my name that would run in perpetuity. A flattering and not inexpensive honour. Right, Sir Cameron. So the chair was set up in 1990 and the whole university has benefited from it ever since. To our great fortune, Sir Cameron chose St. Catherine's to be the home for the chair, and the then Master, Sir Brian Smith, relished the opportunity and facilitated the integration of the chair into college life. Sir Cameron was very clear that the chair should not be an academic appointment, but should be held by a practicing theatre professional. It was also clear that its remit should be broad enough to include musical theatre as well as drama. And the fact that Sir Cameron persuaded Stephen Sondheim to take up the first chair in 1990 underscored this point. Greg Doran will be our 29th Cameron Mackintosh Professor. We missed a couple of years due to COVID. The list of 28 includes directors like Richard Attenborough, Nicholas Heitner and Deborah Warner, writers like Arthur Miller, Tom Stoppard and Tim Rice, actors like Diana Rigg, Patrick Stewart and Adjo Ando, producers and designers like Michael Codron and Thelma Holt. And Thelma Holt was closely associated with the professorship long after her 1998-99 tenure. This list categorizes holders as if each one had just one string to their bow, but of course nothing could be further from the truth. One of the holders of the chair, Mira Sial, for instance, is described as a comedian, writer, playwright, singer, journalist and actress. And we will soon see example. Now there's going to be some dancing and singing. No. The professor always delivers an inaugural, but these have taken many forms over the years. Each professor has then decided what other activities to offer throughout the year. Stephen Sondheim started the tradition of inviting friends from the theatre world for events in college. Students have been invited to theatre rehearsals, theatre performances and film sets, and many of the professors have delivered workshops that have helped our students understand how to break into the world of acting, writing or filmmaking, or just to deepen an understanding of and passion for the world of theatre. So I'm delighted that this year we have Greg Doran as our Cameron Mackintosh visiting professor, and that students will be given the opportunity to be involved in the production of The Two Gentlemen of Verona. Tonight he will be in conversation with Professor Bart van Es under the title My Shakespeare, a director's journey through the First Folio. Bart van Es is Professor of English Literature and a Fellow of the College. He's a Renaissance scholar with a particular interest in Shakespeare and his contemporaries. He's currently working on a book about Shakespeare's lead comic actor, Robert Armin. But he's also a multi-talented gentleman. He won the Costa Book of the Year Award in 2018 for The Cutout Girl, a book about a young girl in hiding throughout the Second World War in the Netherlands. So I will leave it to Bart to introduce our new professor. But first, there are a number of people I want to thank. Neither this event nor what is to come throughout the year happened without many people's input. All our thanks go to Sir Cameron Mackintosh, of course, whose generous contribution made the past 30 years of the professorship and all that it's given to the university and to the college possible. I would like to thank the members of the management board, Fram Dinshaw, Nick Allett, Judith Buchanan and Laura Tunbridge. All of those people have played a key role in making sure that it is Greg Doran who is our professor this year, but all of whom have also done much beyond that. Becca Maddox was in charge of finding an alternative venue once it became clear that we couldn't be in St. Catherine's College. So it's she who's found this splendid venue and she's responsible for all the practical arrangements. Cayena Poncione Bailey, thank you. She's been involved in the preparations for this evening and for many things associated with the preparations for the performance that is to come during the year. And many thanks to you, Cayena. You've done a lot of work already. We will be working closely with the University Drama Fund this year, and I'm grateful to both this year's and last year's University Drama officers, Vicky Stone and Dorothy McDowell. And we will also be working with the Humanities Cultural Programme, and John Fulljames and Josie Bamford have been very helpful there. So thank you all for all you've done to make this evening possible and the events to come during the year possible. And of course, to Greg Doran for accepting the chair, and to both you and Bart for what's to come this evening. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Master. It's an enormous honour to be introducing Greg Doran as that 29th in this very illustrious list of Cameron Mackintosh professors.
Well, it's an illustrious list.
It really is.
It's intimidating.
Well, it needn't be intimidating. I think you fit in very comfortably. So Greg, as probably everyone here knows already, has been at the heart of the Royal Shakespeare Company for even more years than the 33 of this professorship. And that is a reflection, I think, not of his august age, but rather of his prodigious and meteoric rise to stardom. Greg directed his first RSC production at the age of 34, production of Walcott's The Odyssey, and since then he has directed pretty much all the greats of English theatre history: Judi Dench, Patrick Stewart, Eileen Atkins, Harriet Walter, David Tennant, Anthony Sher. The list is really astonishing. And at the same time, he's done something I think even more surprising, which is hugely expand beyond the normal set of kind of classic Shakespeare plays, which slightly were on a kind of rotunda in the way that the RSC operated. And instead, he's made an absolute effort, a successful effort, to cover all of the plays in the Shakespeare Folio, and indeed to add the poem Venus and Adonis to that list. He's expanded also into Shakespeare's contemporaries, playwrights like Marsden, Chapman, Johnson. On top of that, he's also a director of modern theatre productions like the musical The Boy in the Dress. He's somebody who has a Sam Wanamaker Award, an Olivier Award. I, again, couldn't really go to run the full gamut of the awards he's given, but he's really very widely recognised as one of the star Shakespeareans of our age. So it's a privilege to be able to speak to someone this steeped in Shakespeare and global theatre, really. And I want to leave time for questions, so I will press on. I mean, Greg, when did this adoration you clearly have for Shakespeare begin?
Oh, gosh. I think my dad used to get box sets of records, and when I was about 8, along with a box set of, I don't know, Beethoven symphonies or something, came this 45 RPM little record of the music for Mendelssohn's Midsummer Night's Dream, with extracts in between the sections. And so, apart from this extraordinary music, I was taken into this amazing world. It was an American production, so there were American actors, and an actress was playing Puck, and when she said, "Up with a girdle round about the earth in 40 minutes," I thought, A, she sounds exactly like Mickey Mouse, but how does you put a girdle round about the earth? And then also discovered that my dad, who was a scientist, had told me that just before I was born, Sputnik had launched the space race, and Sputnik could circle the Earth in an hour and a half. So Puck was twice as fast as Sputnik. And so I just became completely kind of obsessed by this world of magical forest and fairies and a man with a donkey's head and what's not to love. You know, I guess I got the bug quite early. And then I think the other big thing in my life was going to a school in Preston, a Jesuit college, where they did a Shakespeare play every year. So
you had a kind of early role as Lady Macbeth.
I included Lady Macbeth. I missed out on Ophelia in 2A, went to Gags Ronson, may he rot in hell. But the following year I got Lady Anne in Richard III. And I did indeed play Lady Macbeth. In fact, when I directed Harriet Walter in that role, as her press night present, I gave her a picture of me playing Lady Macbeth, and she said it was the weirdest first night card she'd ever had from her director. So yeah, that was a really, and I suppose in a way, Shakespeare, the bug bit before I had to sort of start, writing essays about him, or, I wanted to be in those plays. I wanted to put those plays on. So it was an entirely kind of practical sense. And I devoured them because I was going, which part am I going to play, I did graduate onto male roles, I should just say that. I played, Richard II and Malvolio and things like that.
And there was a sort of touch of you as director, to sort of pursue the Lady Macbeth thing. You had a professional troupe, and you spotted early on that the leading lady was kind of missing the word compunctious and replaced it with horrid, and you as a precocious schoolboy corrected her, right?
It must have been really, really painful. I mean, so I was doing the play at school, and I remember, weirdly, Preston, you wouldn't think was this cultural hub, but I saw 3 productions of Macbeth in one day, one of which was the Polanski film at the ABC in Fishergate in the morning. One was a touring production which came to our schools, I think from the Liverpool Everyman, and this was the production in question. They mucked around in my young mind too much with the text. So, sometimes now I think of it was rather brilliant. So they replaced the porter scene with knock knock, who's there? Tom who, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow.
I think that's too much for my taste.
Yeah, okay, a bit too far. And the company then came back the following week, I think, to answer questions from the students. And the 3 witches were played by clowns, and they lowered the dagger in front of his face on a fishing line. And anyway, Lady Macbeth, instead of saying the line, "Saw the compunctious visitings of nature shake my fell purpose," yes, she said, "lest all the horrid visitings of nature shake my fell purpose." And I went, it's not the line. And I didn't know what compunctious meant necessarily, but I knew it had a k and a p and a sh, and horrid just didn't do it, So I guess I began to just love the words, and then Shakespeare really became a kind of passport through my life. Being grabbed as a kid with those stories of deserts and shipwrecks and witches and fairies and what have you, and then somehow as I started doing the plays as a teenager, discovering that how is it that this writer knew what I was thinking? How is it that somehow he could articulate my profoundest thoughts that I thought only I had, and could do them in such memorable language? So you progress through this sort of appreciation of Shakespeare, and then it's, I don't know, the politics or the psychology that grabs you, and I think I was very lucky that was my sort of introduction and my passport. But I was very lucky because getting to do the plays at school was a huge plus.
You went to Bristol University. I'm always reluctant to encourage students to spend their entire time doing plays, but is that kind of what you did at Bristol?
Yeah, pretty much, yeah. I had set up a company. I bullied my friends while I was still at school. So we did a Shakespeare every year, but I wanted to carry on doing it. So in the summer holidays, I bullied my mates into putting on a production of Twelfth Night in a courtyard, 1600 courtyard in Astley Hall in Chorley, and we just got all the friends together, and I must have been a real bully actually. I don't remember it as that, but we started putting on the plays, and we did the Comet Errors the following year, and I realised that I guess I probably realised I was a control freak and wanted to have a sense of the whole thing, not just one particular aspect of it. And in a way that I suppose led me through to then thinking very seriously about whether I was going to do this professionally or not. My headmaster, Father Wren, had actually very, very carefully said to me, I know you're going in for the Oxbridge exams, but have you thought about doing an English and drama degree? Because that's clearly what you're going to do, because I wasn't doing anything else. And I thought that was a very wise thought for him. Not that I would necessarily have got into either of those places anyway, but it was for me the right place and the right time, and it gave me a grounding in both the academic side of theatre as a discipline, but also began to make me aware of the possibilities of staging and the technical side as well.
Just to be serious, I mean, I think this may come a little later on, but that activity of having to raise money, run a production, I remember you said in your book that actually exposed you early on to some kind of quite serious sort of sexual threats, actually.
It was. We had landed, I had a marvellous sort of associate, brilliant guy called Chris Grady, and Chris was doing a maths degree, and he was just a brilliant kind of administrator and had great initiative. And he managed to persuade, so this is 1979, so Mrs. Thatcher has just come in and she has basically just cut the arts budget by, I can't remember how much it was, 10% something, and put the burden of arts sponsorship onto the corporate sector. And so we were all to go out and look for corporate sponsorship. And as a result of that, via Chris's brilliance, we managed to persuade a computer company to give this student theatre company £30,000 to tour the UK. And it was a ridiculous amount of money. I didn't know that then. For me, I just wanted, that's what we got. So that's what we asked for. That's what we got. What happened was we did a press launch in London. We were doing Romeo and Juliet and touring the country, and why didn't all the broadsheets turn up? I mean, we had basically the Chicken Breeders Gazette there, and there was very little coverage. And I thought we're going to get a real, bollocking from this company. And the guy said, he seemed fine, and he said, no, don't worry about it, these things happen, and are you going back to Bristol tonight? And I said, yes. And he said, it's only because I have a flat close by in Mayfair with some very fine Hogarth engravings you might enjoy. I thought somebody has actually said to me, come up and see my etching. I refused, as politely as I could, and the following day was summoned to his office to meet him and a phalanx of his henchmen, and was told that they were withdrawing the sponsorship entirely, bearing in mind I was about to start rehearsals in a month's time and had a whole tour booked out. And he just said that's, the last night was just the last straw. So I went out, and in those days there were telephone boxes with telephone books. So I opened the telephone directory and thought, well, who is this computer company's biggest rival? And I thought, well, I didn't really know. I thought, well, I've heard of IBM, so let's try that. So I phoned the head office of as I say it now, I'm remembering how ludicrous all this was. But so I asked to speak to the chairman, to speak to the chairman of IBM, and got through to the secretary, or got through to somebody who said, "Come upstairs and we're on the top floor," and whatever. And they said, well, IBM can't sponsor you, but we'd like to know what the problem is. And they put me on a train to go and see a man called Luke Rittner, who ran what was then called the Association of Business Sponsorship of the Arts, who had been set up precisely to deal with the interaction between the corporate world and the arts. And this was precisely the kind of thing that needed to be avoided. And in the end, through the good offices of somebody on our headed notepaper, who was marvellously Lord Burkitt, Chris Grady got him, along with Dulcie Gray. I don't know quite what the choice was there, but Lord Burkitt then basically said, I've been on the phone to this man, and you're getting all the sponsorship back. Though he did say, no, I don't think you deserve it, because you are completely unproven as a company. And he said, but now you have to go and meet this guy. So I had to go and meet this guy, and I said, I'm not meeting him in the office, we'll meet in a neutral place. And I remember him saying to me, why was all this fuss? What were you doing? And I said, well, you put me in a very difficult position, you know. And he said, I was testing your metal. So,
no, but it's a very disturbing story, and I think it's very impressive the way that you stood up to that. And there have been other occasions which we won't go into, but that is part of the world, and I do want to think a bit about those pressures within the world of production. So after Bristol, you went to Bristol Old Vic Drama School. I'd love to hear a bit about that transition that you really made, possibly already then. I mean, you went there as part of the acting course, but you were thinking already about directing?
Yes, I guess I wasn't really making a distinction between them, but I realized, having done this production of Romeo and Juliet, which I directed, that the production was with students from university courses, drama courses, and from students from drama schools. And what I'd noticed was that the drama school students all thought that the university students were a bit too, cerebral, and they were too much in their heads, and they needed to get into their bodies. And the university students all thought the drama school students, well, they were suspicious that they had this thing called technique, which they didn't quite know what it was, but they needed to sort of be able to find out about. And I thought, well, if I'm going to be a director, then in a way, I sort of need to know it from both points of view. So I'd done the university drama course, and I did a postgrad acting course at the Old Vic School. And that really was absolutely invaluable. That sort of understanding what it was that the actor experienced and required and could rely on from a classical training. And I suppose that made me I learned very important things about directing, I think.
Rudy Shelley was particularly important.
Wonderful Rudy Shelley. Rudy Shelley, funnily enough, Patrick Stewart, whose book has just come out and who I am interviewing on Sunday, in his book he mentions Rudy Shelley too, because when he was a schoolboy, he encountered Rudy. Rudy was this amazing guy. He was old enough to be Prussian. He had fled Nazi Germany as a Jew and had ended up in Palestine, and then came to the Bristol Old Vic Theatre School as it was starting out. And he just had a fantastic way of making his point in a way that all the students would remember. And he would say, so he would do this thing about breath support, which anybody who ever went to Bristol Old Vic Theatre School will immediately know this. If somebody says to you, squeeze your lemons, it's an exercise that Rudy would make the class do. I'm looking around. There's somebody here who knows exactly what I'm talking about, who was at drama school with me. And you had to get you had to pretend, you had to close your eyes and imagine that there was a little lemon in the crack of your bum, and then you had to very gently squeeze the lemon so that the juice dribbled down your legs. I can see you're all picturing this. And so that was squeeze your lemon. What it did was it activated the lower stomach muscles, and that was engaging your breath for your vocal support. And, we didn't know that. We just imagined squeezing our lemons. And somehow that just is an example. I did a production of The Winter's Tale, co-directed with a friend of mine, and we set it in a we thought rather brilliant way. Or we decided we would set it that we would all play children in a Victorian attic. You got it, haven't you? You could see it immediately. Yeah. And that somehow we would act out The Winter's Tale. And Rudy came to see it, and we were all very nervous about what he was going to say. We had one little drawl and this great big ring on one finger, and he would point at you. And he's at the end of the show, he said to me, Greg, don't want to be clever. And it was the best piece of advice I've ever had as a classical director, because it's sort of, what he was saying was, just do the play. Don't get in between the audience and the play. Just do the play. That's hard enough. So, the fact that we were all pretending to be Victorian school children in an attic. The bear was very good. The bear was a great big. The bear is always good, though. The bear was a fur coat on a hanger that somebody. I won't go into that. The world doesn't need to know about that. So yeah, I think Rudy was really important in my sense of what it was that a director did. And then it wasn't until a bit later. I then went into the profession as an actor. Partly because I realized that most directors don't get to see other directors work. Actors get to see other directors work all the time, obviously, but many directors don't see how directors are operating. And I had the opportunity of doing that as an actor, watching some very good and some not so good directors, and thinking, I'm going to remember that. I'm going to remember how they did that, or how they encouraged or inspired that, and I'm never going to do that. And in a way, that's what brought me to Stratford as an actor, and had the opportunity first of watching some great directors, Terry Hands and obviously John Barton and Bill Alexander, great directors, and then becoming an assistant director, because I read a piece of Flaubert who says most people end up in life doing what they do second best, and a lot of people wondering there. And the trick is to know what you do first best and then to do it. And to me, at that point, I thought, there are a lot of young actors playing floppy head parts like the ones I'm getting, and I realized that when I was thinking about plays, I wasn't casting me. So I thought it was I was following my nose, really, but it felt as though that way also I think I felt I had more control of my career too.
I mean, I'd love to go into a bit more detail about what the job of a director is. I mean, it seems the way you work is very much from the language of the play initially, sort of out to a vision of the characters, rather than with this kind of top-down conceptual notion. And could I sort of pin you down specifically on, say, the Lear you did with Anthony Sher, where Anthony, of course, your husband, now sadly lost, but Anthony wrote that kind of wonderful book, The Year of the King, where he describes that. And could you just sort of say how that production grew?
I guess the relationship with Tony was very much about what I had learned as a director, I guess, in terms of it being a genuine collaboration. And I knew that when I went into a rehearsal room, I had already done three major things, particularly with Shakespeare, one of which was to cut it, one of which was to cast it, and one of which was to design it. And that process needed to engage with whoever your leading actors were going to be. So I would never, at Stratford, I would never say I'm going to do a particular production. I was never going to do Hamlet unless I knew who was playing Hamlet, and I was never going to do King Lear until I knew who was playing King Lear. And it was, in a way, that then became about how do we see this play and want to realize it. Obviously, I come in with some ideas, but Tyrone Guthrie said that 80% of good casting is, 80% of good directing is good casting.
Yeah.
So particularly with those great walloping parts, that you need to find somebody who's going to bring that to the table. The first Shakespeare I did at Stratford was Henry VIII, All Is True. And I remember Adrian Noble saying to me, work with people who are better than you. Be ambitious about, even though that might be terrifying, do it. And to me, that was really good advice, because that is how you learn. And I suppose I had, by that point, really understood from both sides of the footlights, if you like, what acting in Shakespeare, what playing to those audiences was like. And there's one, I've told this story elsewhere, so forgive me if you heard me say this before, but I was assistant director to Terry on a production of Romeo and Juliet, and Mark Rylance was playing Romeo, so it tells you how long ago it was. And he was directing the scene where Juliet takes the potion that the friar has given her. And the actress, so we were in the Swan Theatre, and she was there musing over this potion. And she said, "What if this be a poison the friar subtly administered to have me dead?" And Terry said, "Who are you talking to?" And she said, "Myself." And he pointed around the Swan Theatre and said, "Who are all these people?" And she said, "Well, the audience." And he said, "No, they're your sounding board. They're your confidants. They're your friends. Ask them. Do it again." So she went, "What if this be a poison the friar subtly administered to have me dead?" And I, sitting there, went, "I don't know." Because suddenly, instead of observing this, I was engaged. I was complicit in her decision. And that taught me a huge amount about the difference between, as it were, performing Shakespeare live in a theatre space like the RST or the Swan or the Globe, and as it were, just taking it into yourself. That it's a two-way. When he talks about the 2 hours traffic of the stage, it's not just what's going this way, it's what's going this way.
Yeah.
And I found that really important. And also in terms of investigating text, that I've never done that. I've put on several Shakespeare plays. We read it, and then we just stood up and did it. And I realized that there was, until you really, really knew what you were saying, there was no point in getting up and doing it, because that, then you're going to be random in your objectives. And whereas if you actually specifically knew what you're trying to get out of the scene or how you're trying to affect somebody else, then when it stands itself on its feet at some point in the rehearsals, then you just edit what those actors bring, because they know what they're saying.
Sounds like that checklist of things that you did with Lear. So there's you have the text. You've cut that to a certain extent. You've got your casting. And then you said design it. I mean, is that because that was a production kind of felt partly like it was in ancient Britain, and then also had this kind of slightly Francis Bacon-like feel with these enormous glass boxes around Lear. Was that something you had right at that moment when you brought your actors together?
It was, but I had already done. We did a workshop. I was terrified of King Lear. My dad had dementia, and I think that's why for years I couldn't even watch the play. And Tony, who had been in it several times, loved it and knew that it was a play that we knew that it was a play. I knew that it was a play he wanted to do, and we had 2016, the big quinquagenary of Shakespeare's death was coming up, and I knew that would be, if we were going to do something special. We hadn't worked together oddly when we made the decision for a decade, and it seemed like the right choice of play. And I said, he said to me very gently, he said, "I know your fear of this play, but I have to tell you, I don't think Lear has dementia." And I kind of went, so we began to explore it together, and we did a workshop. And out of that workshop, at which the designer was present, we just began to see that there were, in a way, because Lear's journey descends from this, grand person in charge of everything, ruling the kingdom, to depleted, mad, strict man running around naked on a heath. It goes from kind of grand opera to Samuel Beckett.
Yeah.
And I wanted, in order to sense that sense of the Samuel Beckett, to be able to produce this sort of grand opera. So we had probably the most elaborate opening of King Lear ever, in that in this sort of ancient setting, Tony's Lear arrived in a sort of great big kind of wolf coat with his crown, but also in a sort of pope-mobile, a sort of glass case, and carried by actually the stage crew, of course, and surrounded by his daughters and the entire kingdom, and an amazing entry music by Ilona Sekash with sort of great big taiko drums and drones and all sorts of things. And when we did the first take, everything came together. The supernumeraries with great big golden bows and great metal doors that slid open, and this huge music, and Tony's grand entrance. And they brought him down to the front of the stage, they lowered the box, and behind me, all of the people who had been working on that production, from all the tech departments arrived, and they all sort of burst into a round of applause. And I said over what we call the God mic, I said, "Ladies and gentlemen, you have to be married to the artistic director of the Royal Shakespeare Company to get an entrance like that." It was very much looking at the end of the play to try and work out how we wanted the play to start.
Yeah, I know it's interesting. I mean, Tony did worry about the idea that this might seem nepotistic. But, I mean, clearly you had an amazing working relationship with him, and he would come already with, I think, quite profound visions of what these characters were. I mean, in the Falstaff, the case of Falstaff, really thinking about Falstaff as a kind of recovering or unsuccessful alcoholic. So is that often the case, that an actor will come to you with a vision of the part already? And how do you accommodate that if that's the case?
Generally not to the degree that Tony has sort of thought through it. And, but every actor will have very specific ideas, often about very particular moments in the production. I don't think of the director as the dictator. I think of him or her as the editor, if you like, or the inspirer, and being able to take through a process that will prevent it from being a star vehicle to being an ensemble piece. And that involves, and I knew from playing opposite Tony, in fact, my first role at Stratford, playing Salanio in The Merchant of Venice, and he was playing Shylock. And I felt in that production, directed by Bill Alexander, that my contribution had been invited, and my investment in the production was secure, so much so that I thought that, in my head, the play was called The Merchant of Venice and His Friend Salanio. To me, there was a great, profound difference between being involved to that extent and being made to feel as though you are part of it, to the sort of realization that you may, Salanio doesn't have many lines actually, but I felt invested. And I guess that was a lesson that I learned, and the way of doing that shaped how I would run early rehearsals, in that I often, on the first ever rehearsals, people do a read-through and they show the model, and sometimes what happens is you hear a read-through and you go, well, that performance isn't going to change in rehearsal now, is it? That's it. And sometimes people mumble their way through, and sometimes, there's different levels of articulacy. And then you see the set model, the costume designs, and you go, oh, I see. Okay, well, any contribution I have to make is very limited then. And if you are playing Salanio, you then realize how small your part is. So I always start by working around the room. So we sit at the table and we read through the play, and then we put it all into our own words. if you're doing Hamlet, this can take quite a long time. And David Tennant, I remember, by the time we actually got on our feet, was sort of raring to go. But it did mean that, that person, as it were, playing third spear carrier on the left, had invested and contributed in a way that could be revelatory, that suddenly a perspective that you weren't expecting comes out of left field and changes your view of the play or of the action. So I've found that really, really important to do, to investigate that text, and so that we as a company know what the play is doing. And the play turns out to be what it is because we have that encouragement, that investment has been encouraged, and therefore maintaining it over what can be a very long run. Sometimes Stratford performances there could be 150 performances. So it meant that you continued to investigate and explore, and that I found that was very useful for me to learn as a director how to encourage that ensemble spirit.
On the one hand, you have this model of an organic development of the play, between you and the actors working from the text, thinking about the words. But then you have also done productions that have felt very much kind of zeitgeist productions. Your Johannesburg Titus Andronicus from '96. You did Thomas More with very much kind of sense of that relating to kind of the race riots of the 80s. So how do you get that balance between a kind of notion of, I suppose, a production that's saying something to the present moment to a notion of kind of Shakespeare for all time?
Well, I think that's partly by letting the play breathe, and by not sort of determining that Shakespeare plays, there's some definitive version of that play that you're trying to reach. Right. There's only what you are going to do with that group of actors, that set of creatives, and that audience in that moment in time. And if you've premeditated that too much, you're going to miss what's actually happening in the world. And therefore, if you as a group, you're bringing your hearts and minds to that, then you will reflect the world around you. And sometimes that's really surprising. So we were doing King John, and it was quite a long way into the run, and it was oddly a Tuesday matinee for some reason in the Swan Theatre. And we started at 1:30, and as we began, there was a television in the crew room below the stage, and the crew were watching it in between cues, and they watched as a plane flew into a building in New York, and the company were coming down and watching it unfold. And then, of course, there's the terrible moment when the second plane hits the second tower, and people started saying, "What are we going to do? And should we stop the play?" And the decision was made just to keep going. And of course, in those days, people didn't have mobile phones and weren't texting all the time. So we got through the interval, and the audience still didn't know what had happened. And the weird thing was that the play itself seemed to respond to it. The play, I felt that the first half, particularly the first half of the play, is a political satire. A satire about politicians who say black is white one moment and black is black the next. And then the whole play turns on the death of a child. As Prince Arthur weirdly slips from a high tower, which we had staged, just as people were jumping from the twin trade towers. And then the bastard, who's the sort of moral compass in the play, in a way, our guide through the play, he suddenly said, "Now vast confusion waits upon the world." I have never known Shakespeare respond actually as things are happening to the moment we were in. And I think if I'd decided the play was a great big kind of rollicking comedy or whatever, maybe that freshness would not because Shakespeare, we all say it, don't we, that he's like a magnet that attracts all the iron filings and what's going on in the world. If you allow it to do that, then those plays so many times, in my experience, respond to that moment.
Yeah, and this is clearly something that happens in academia as well. We see developments, we think about kind of, colonization, and suddenly the plays are profoundly informed by colonization, or we think about gender roles, the plays are kind of informed by that.
Yeah. In Cymbeline, which was the last one I did, I was amazed because it seemed that, like, if somebody had said, "Have you had somebody in to freshen up the lines?" Imogen, dressed as a boy, turns to the audience when she's met the boys, who turn out to be her long-lost brothers, on the Welsh mountainside. He turns to the audience and says, "I've changed my sex to be companion to these boys." You go, the concept that changing your sex is even something you could imagine 400 years ago is absolutely there in Shakespeare, and it's there in the line. Anyway, that's his genius.
Yeah. So we don't need to change the plays, and in a way, those productions, like the Johannesburg production, wasn't deliberately making the play's violence immediately relevant to what was going on in Johannesburg.
It's in a way, doing it in South Africa meant that the play, instead of being a sort of Grand Guignol bloodbath, turned from that to being really a plea for reconciliation. In fact, Marcus Andronicus, Titus's brother, at the end of the play, after the carnage of the final scene, turns to the audience and says, "We must learn to pull this scattered corn into one mutual sheaf." I mean, that's such an extraordinary, I've misquoted the line, but it's an extraordinary line about how do you break the cycles of violence that are evident in that play, and how do you, as a society, try and move forward? And we were making it relevant. That production, was sort of being upstaged by life in South Africa at that time. But yeah, I don't know. That is just his genius, and I don't know how he does it.
Yeah. And how does that relate to casting? Because you've done a lot of breakthrough things. The first disabled actor, well, maybe not the first, but you've cast disabled actress Richard III. You've cast Catherine Hunter as Titus. You've cast a non-white Romeo. Is that something you've noticed changing over your time as a director? Casting.
Well, it's been a positive decision to move forward on that. So that very first production of The Odyssey I did in '92 with Derek Walcott, Derek was the first black writer to be commissioned by the RSC, and it felt to me as though to suddenly do that with a Daz White cast would have been anathema. And as a result of that, the next show I did at TOP was B. Bandelli's Orinoco, which required, I think it was 8 or 10 black actors. And those actors had then to be cast through the rest of the company. So as a result of that decision, quarter of the RSC company that time, for the first time ever, were from the global majority. And it felt to me, and one of those actors was David Oyelowo, so hey, it all worked out. And it seemed to me that if as Hamlet says, Shakespeare, the purpose of playing is as it were to hold the mirror up to nature, and you look at that reflection, and you look at that mirror and you don't see your own reflection, why are you going to engage? So to me, we had to reflect the world we were in, or the world we were about to be in. And so, when I did the Julius Caesar set in contemporary Africa with Miss Ando there, we first of all got a group of people together to try out the idea and see if it sort of had, legs. And it seemed to me that, we had fantastic black actors with the classical chops to do it, which maybe when Derek Walcott was first, commissioned by the RSC, we didn't have to the same extent. And therefore it was an opportunity, just as doing a Troilus and Cressida, again with Andrew Ando, doing Troilus and deciding absolutely consciously that I would make that the first RSC production that was gender balanced, and doing it with a play that maybe was the most difficult one to do it because of all the very macho posturing, and indeed wanting to retain the homoerotic elements between Achilles and Patroclus and indeed the banter with Ajax and Hector. It seemed to me that some of those roles were not defined by their gender but by their function. And I wanted a devious manipulator as Ulysses, and I found it in Angela Ander.
The Telegraph, I think, had an entire page of critical letters headed Wokespeare. Are you worried about falling out with the Telegraph?
Not massively. But in a way, you see, the ideas aren't necessarily going to work. In that production of Troilus, we cast the first deaf actor as Cassandra. And when Charlotte Arrowsmith came into audition for the role, what she brought was a lived experience, a lifetime of not being understood, sometimes willfully not being understood. And therefore, as Cassandra is blessed with the gift of prophecy and cursed that nobody will believe her, that frustration that she used, using BSO, in fact, rather than the text. I think Cassandra actually only has 18 lines or something. But what it did was it made it so potent. Yeah. But it also made me think, wait a minute, I've neglected this community. There's some great actors here. And so inevitably doing Richard III, and obviously Tony Sher's fingerprints were kind of all over that play as I was thinking about it, I realized that, I should first be looking for actors with a lived experience of disability. And meeting Arthur Hughes, I would not have cast him as Richard III had he not been a brilliant actor. But to me, it was an important thing that somebody with a lived experience had. So it changed the nature of the play in very specific ways, so that, the number of insults hurled at Richard are not being hurled at a prosthetic hump. They're being hurled at somebody who has lived that throughout their entire lives. I remember Arthur telling me a story about when he was in Cardiff as a young actor training. So Arthur has radial dysplasia, so he has what he calls his little arm, and he had this sort of bomber jacket, and he was coming home one night through Cardiff with his hands in his pockets, and he encountered a group of young men who were clearly out for a fight and wanted to mug him. And so he was bracing himself, and then as he braced himself, he took his hands out of his pockets, and one of them said, "Oh, look, lads, he's got a funny hand, we'll then leave him." And Arthur said he was terrified at the potential of violence, but infuriated at being underestimated. And it just changed the nature of how we saw every moment of that play, really. And I don't think that necessarily means now no, as it were, able-bodied actor can play the part, because never say never. But what we learned by having an actor with that lived experience was, for me, radically changed my view of the play.
So you said this thing at Cheltenham Literary Festival about knowing, I think, a number of male white actors who were looking for work. Tell me about that.
Well, of course. So I guess I have tried to really pioneer diversity in terms of ethnicity, in terms of gender, in terms of disability, in terms of regionality. So there are more voices on, one of our major stages, and the opportunity for those different voices to be represented and heard. And I had been asked, so are there any consequences of that? And I said, yeah. I get agents saying to me, chewing my ear off, saying, but this means that some of my clients suddenly aren't doing nearly as much work with you as they used to do. And you kind of go, I guess that there's a fallout. So So how that got turned into a headline about me thinking white male actors don't get enough work, I don't know, but that's what happened.
Yeah, I mean, people sort of pick on this sort of idea of the pendulum swinging. I mean, did you
I
feel
guess
that
my sense is that there isn't a level playing field at the moment, whether that's for women in Shakespeare, whether that's for disabled actors, whatever that's, those playing fields are level. And until they are, then we need to make positive steps to allow us to look at those different communities and say, come onto our stages. And that's not just actors. That's one of the things I guess that when I joined the RSC, there were very few women directors. And by the time we got to, I think it was the 2018 season, maybe something like that, maybe about 5 years in, the entire summer season at Stratford was directed by women. Now, that wasn't a sales pitch. It wasn't a marketing ploy. It just had happened organically by that point. And it seemed to me that was really how it should happen. We don't notice. Suddenly David Oyelowo is playing the first black actor to play an English history king. Outrage. And then suddenly, that's now accepted, and what we're looking for is great acting, and that is what's more important.
Yeah, and still, in fact, I think it's Lloyd Webber's survey of sort of involvement of BAME people within the theatrical world still only 14%. So it's hardly the case that
it's because we've also got to be very careful that that the invitation is there. So what I was saying about seeing, so Bally Gill played Romeo for us. Bally is of Indian heritage from Coventry. Now he wouldn't have thought of. He might have thought of being an actor, but wouldn't have thought necessarily that the RSC was the place for him if we hadn't actually changed our policies, so not policies as such, but changed our habits so that we were genuinely reflecting the world we are in, not just locally in Stratford and Coventry and Birmingham, but that we were genuinely reflecting society.
So I want to move on because I'm aware time is ticking. And we've always had this particular passion for the folio, haven't you? I mean, this determination to span the folio, cover all the plays in it, and you've, I think, since retiring or becoming the Emeritus Artistic Director at the RSC, you've gone on this crazy road trip to try and see all of the folios, right?
Yeah. We have a folio. We have 3 folios in Stratford. And each of them, I realise, has a very extraordinary story about evidence of 400 years of readership, of provenance, of the people who've read these books and treasured them or neglected them. And as I just got various opportunities to travel to various places, I began to unpick some of these stories and become completely fascinated by them. And it just then started to roll. We think there were 750 printed. That might be a conservative estimate. 235 survive, and 50 of them are in the UK. There are 3 in the Southern Hemisphere, and 13, I think, in Japan. And I got an opportunity to visit 1 or 2 of those places, and again, for instance, the one in Cape Town and the one in Auckland were donated by the same colonial governor, as it happened. Sir George Grey was colonial governor in Cape Town and then twice in Auckland. And,
he was handing them out everywhere.
And what was interesting was partly the way in which those 2 countries looked after them and used them, and negotiated, is this a colonial imposition, or is this evidence of a universal writer who's been relevant for 400 years? And the complexity of those questions were really addressed in Auckland. and they were aware of the fact that perhaps what Gray was doing was saying, here is the evidence of the supremacy of the English language, and therefore why it should be universally adopted at the expense of indigenous languages. And the arguments were circulating in New Zealand about a Shakespeare Schools Festival that had had some funding removed, and what that was about, and was that therefore was Shakespeare indeed knocking indigenous voices off the stage, etc. So there was a very live debate. At the same time, I saw a fantastic production of King Lear with a very diverse cast by the Auckland Theatre Company. In Cape Town, there was a very different view of the book. It was the least viewed copy of the folio that I'd ever seen. And it was as if there was a sort of slight embarrassment about this ownership of this folio. At the same time, I also then met with fantastic people running the Shakespeare Schools Festival in all of South Africa, who were absolutely articulate about how Shakespeare could transform young people's lives and how relevant he was to their existence. And I found that very interesting as to what this folio means 400 years later, if you like. So that's what I am currently. It is a massive piece of displacement activity, clearly, but it's just been fascinating talking to the people who look after these books and how they use them and what they're there for.
I hope it isn't displacement activity from working on Two Gentlemen of Verona, which obviously is your job for the upcoming year, though you probably have others as well. I mean, I'll end on that. I mean, it seems to me a tricky play to put on. I mean, gender, politics, kind of rape at the end. Yeah. How are you thinking about those things?
I guess that there are sort of complementary and contradictory reasons why I would like to do Two Gents. One of which is that having worked through the folio, and when I took over as artistic director, we'd made this decision that we wouldn't, to break down that conveyor belt potential, that we would work through the entire canon of plays in the First Folio without, as they say on radio, for hesitation, repetition, or deviation. And that we wouldn't be doing, as we had in one decade between 2000 and 2010, 5 different productions of Romeo and Juliet. So it would mean that with plays as they came up were an event, and that we had time to think about them and the conversation they had with other plays. And so I had I'd produced Simon Godwin's production of Two Gentlemen of Verona, and I thought to myself, well, I hadn't directed that play. So the reason I want to do it is because I don't know it. I mean, I know it. I've seen it many times, but until you actually work on a play and direct that play and get the perspectives of actors and creatives onto that page, then you don't know it in that sort of depth as I know the rest of the canon. So and it's a play about young people leaving home, learning how to make their way in the world and making horrible mistakes. And falling in love and falling out of love and negotiating what those relationships are. And I thought, actually, the invitation to be the CanMac professor is a perfect opportunity. I don't know what else I would do. I mean, I'm not very good at lecturing or whatever. So I would, to actually work on a play with young people whose lived experience, talking of lived experience, is very much like Proteus and Valentine and Julia and Sylvia, would be a great opportunity. And I think there are deep complexities that need to be addressed right in the face. And who better to do that with than people who are engaged in life and interested in Shakespeare and hopefully will bring it to their own lives. So it's an entirely selfish reason for doing it, because I haven't done that play, but it also feels potentially an exciting play to do in this context, with this student body, with the context of the young creatives and people that I get to work with, and what better way of passing on any legacy you might have than actually doing it practically on its feet.
I think we're all hugely looking forward to that. Thank you so much for giving us your time. I could happily talk for another hour, but we have promised to leave time for questions. So I think there are going to be roving mics. So I think there's a hand at the back there, if there is a mic around. I saw some. Yeah, there's a mic.
Oh, you've got
your way. Oh, sorry. Well, I picked one right at the back there.
Stick your hand up again. Oh, yeah. Why don't you ask me your question and I'll repeat it?
I can go without.
Okay.
The kind of political resonance of your plays. Obviously, there was the rehearsed reading, I think, of was it Julius Caesar in the House of Commons as another example. Do you think also of at Oxford there's something called the Jesus College Shakespeare Project? Kind of a few of us are involved with, and we put on the Henry VI trilogy last year. And it was very interesting that during kind of the smart city protests, obviously it coincided with the Cade Rebellion, and the play sort of spoke for itself in that respect. But we also went on a bit of a road trip, some of us, to see your production of Cymbeline at Stratford, which we thought was very good. Thing that it seemed to me like Posthumous, for instance, was almost operating his own play. He kind of seemed to shun the audience. And at the end, it seemed like he and Imogen were kind of set aside from the rest of the court. I was wondering, firstly, if Bernard Shaw's Cymbeline Refinished had anything to do with it, and if not, what motivated that directorial decision?
I'm not sure I can repeat the entire question. But if, in terms of the end of Cymbeline and the challenges of that play and George Bernard Shaw's rewrite, George Bernard Shaw just didn't understand the play. I'm sorry. Just didn't understand the play. One of the extraordinary things about Cymbeline is that there are more asides in Cymbeline, or more characters have asides in Cymbeline than in any other Shakespeare play. And what does an aside do? Well, an aside says, watch this from my point of view, and makes a connection with the audience. So what happens is, by the time you get to that last extraordinary scene where all those jigsaw puzzle pieces are going to be put together, you are waiting for that person you've got to know to fit their bit of the jigsaw puzzle in. And I think you're absolutely right about the challenge with Posthumus, one of the most complex characters to resolve in the entire canon. And a bit of dramaturgy that is breathtaking. So that you have been waiting for Imogen, dressed as a boy, to be finally reunited with this man who has ordered an honor killing and has discovered that, in fact, he was abused, she is innocent, he's been deceived, and he howls with pain. At which point, Imogen rushes forward and says, he shouts Imogen in the German, and she rushes forward and says, "Here, my lord." Now, any other writer would go, "Oh, Imogen, you're here," embrace. He doesn't. Posthumus smacks her in the face because he thinks it's a boy, and what's this boy doing interrupting my grief? And that is just astonishing, and makes the audience laugh, shriek, all sorts of things. And it seems to me that they become a very special unit. Tennyson said of the line that he then says, as she picks herself up and says, "Why did you throw your wedded lady from you?" and hugs him and says, "Now throw me, think you're on a rock, now throw me again," which is a challenge. And he says the line that Tennyson felt was the tenderest line in Shakespeare: "Hang there like fruit, my soul, till the tree die." And unless you look at it online, in which case it says, "Hang there like a fruit, my soul, till the tree die," destroying the entire line in one syllable. But that is so kind of special, and they have so much to resolve and so much to work through that in a way the end of the play with all the Romans and the Brits all getting together, sort of they're kind of isolated from that. They've been through that. They've gone beyond that. I don't know if that really answers your question, but that will do for now. Thank you.
Right, we're going from one end to the other. Brilliant.
Thank you so much for that. You spoke so well about casting and design among your three pieces. I wondered if you could talk about cutting the plays, when you do that, what your process is, and sort of, especially when you've done a play several times, how to come to it fresh.
Mostly I haven't done them several times. It's an interesting one. There's always been another one to do. So I did do The Merchant of Venice in Japan in Japanese as well as in England, but that's pretty much the only time. So yeah, I guess one of the things that is now clear to me is that Shakespeare goes at 900 lines an hour, and that's spoken triplingly on the tongue. And therefore, if you want to start, as it were, at 7:30, and you want to come down at 10:30, and you want a 20-minute interval for bladders and bar sales, then you've actually got 2,400 lines to play with. And it's a mathematical equation. Now, only 7 of the plays are that length. Some of them are nearly twice that. So what are you going to do? I don't think Shakespeare can ever have seen Hamlet at the length it is in not the bad quarter, the second quarter, which I think is longer than the folio. Because it would last. Sorry, Shakespeare. Should have just asked you. Because it's knocking on 4.5, if not 5 hours. Now, that's fine. And if you want to do the full Hamlet, absolutely great. And just make sure that you've got it in the schedule so you don't have any matinees, But I don't think Shakespeare can ever have seen it at that length. In fact, I think the first time it was ever done at that length, at full length, was in Stratford in 1899, when the great actor manager Frank Benson did up to the closet scene for the matinee, and from the matinee to for the evening show. And it was known in Stratford as the Eternity Hamlet. So it's a very important thing you're going to do when you're going into rehearsal. I knew David Tennant was going to be, he had agreed to play Hamlet. And one of the things that I had looked at was, in fact, the bad quarto length, which is half the length of the play of the folio. Probably a 2-hour version, if you like, and Gertrude gets an extra scene. But it has lines like, to be or not to be, that's the point. So what we did was to kind of replace those lines with the folio lines and then see what it looked like. And it is very vivid. In the end, I thought it was too much of an academic exercise, and I had, by that time, Patrick Stewart as Claudius and Oliver Ford Davis as Polonius and Penny Downey as Gertrude. But nevertheless, I also knew that with David Tennant playing the part, there was going to potentially be a younger audience, and certainly an audience of the Doctor Who fans, to which I'd had a lot of stick from people saying that you're just exploiting that audience. And I knew that I thought I wanted to bring out the fact of the play being a thriller. And not assume that everybody knew what the play was. So I cut it. I knew, for instance, that I wanted to take the interval at the moment when Hamlet sees Claudius praying and says, "Now might I do it, Pat?" Now he is praying. And David went up to behind Claudius and lifted the dagger to kill him, and we took that as the interval. So that for those people who knew, just might have thought it was a bit gimmicky. But if you were thinking, is Hamlet going to kill? Is he finally going to actually become Action Man and kill the murderer of his father? Then that would be riveting. So the cutting, there's no science to it. In Stratford, we have a great opportunity because we have the prompt copies of all the other productions that have ever been, and I've been in Stratford. I discovered our Hamlet was the 85th Hamlet in Stratford. But you then have the opportunity of going, well, what did John Barton cut? And what did Peter Hall cut? And what did Terry Hams cut? And what did Trevor cut? And it's like I remember doing this with Henry IV, with Tony as Falstaff, and working through it. It was like having those directors in the room with you, sort of going, why did you cut that? Oh, that's a really good transposition, or that's a great bit of doubling you could do there. So there's a sense of being part of a continuum, particularly at Stratford, which is both inspirational and massively intimidating as well. So, but you do have the opportunity also just to realise, how much of the plays people have cut. And you might have gone, oh, I'll do this light cut. And then you find yourself in preview, and the show is coming down at 11:10, and people are kind of going, it's too long, what are you going to do? Richard III, one of the longest plays in the canon, Cymbeline. Well, I cut 30% of Cymbeline, in fact. I guess the skill is to try and cut it so that you don't feel the excisions, and that you also, I have a policy of saying, look, this is what we go into rehearsal with, so this is all negotiable. If you have a line that you want to go back, you let me know what that is, but also tell me which line you're going to cut to replace it, so that I know that the play won't suddenly expand. Having cut 30% of Cymbeline, on the first preview, we still came down at 10 to 11. So it's, and that is without massive amounts of production or fights and dances and all that stuff.
Right, front, lovely.
Greg, I'm an author. My name's Mary, and I've written fiction and non-fiction, and I read theatre at Warwick, and I've seen your productions, and I've seen lots of Tonys. I saw him play the fool when I was a teenager, and all sorts of things. So firstly, thank you. This is very moving for me to hear you talk. But I'm so interested in what you say about language and about cutting. And I remember David Rudkin, the playwright, coming to talk to us at Warwick, and he was talking through 6 cuts he found of one bit of text, and there was this wonderful part that I was in love with. And finally, on the 5th cut, it went. And I said, no! Why did you cut that? It's beautiful. He said, if it doesn't work, the beauty is irrelevant. It doesn't work, it doesn't fit. And of course, now as an author, for me, people think writing is, people have all sorts of ideas about what writing is, what creating is, what directing is, but what you leave behind is so important. My books are all about 30% of what I might start with. And there was a sculptor who said once, when asked, when you've got maybe a propoful, you've got a piece of marble, how do you know where to start to get the elephant? And he says, I just chip away the bits that aren't the elephant. And with Shakespeare, this also this thing of cutting, for me, there's a question here, but when you talk about Shakespeare and Shakespeare's relationship with us throughout time, I often think it's not about finding Shakespeare. For us, it's about finding where we are in Shakespeare, because for me, Shakespeare managed as a writer to do this absolutely extraordinary thing, like a Bach or a Mozart, to embody so much human experience, so much suffering, so much joy, so much complexity, that all we have to do is step in 1900, in 2000, in 2050, 60, 90, take ourselves to Shakespeare and let Shakespeare work, because wherever you go, whichever door of Shakespeare you go through, whichever language you're looking at, we're there, because he's got it all there. So I would say, as an audience member and a lover of language and text and plays and creativity and arts, that you can go anywhere. There is no argument that says, how can a black actor play, or how can a deaf actor play, or how. That's so irrelevant. It's so irrelevant, because Shakespeare is this enormous thing. And when you talked about the cuts, the use of the getting rid of compunctures and
Press you for a question.
Sorry. What I was going to say was, yes, when you're working with Shakespeare now, for me personally, the language is so important and so rich. And how important is it for you as a director when you're working with actors who embody, the language, to work with the language, getting actors who perhaps are not as familiar with it culturally?
I think one of the key things for me is getting. I do a thing called the Shakespeare Gym, and which I hope I'll have the opportunity of doing here in Oxford. But and it's basically a way of kind of limbering up your Shakespeare muscles. But it's also a way of examining the text to try and determine, who the character is from the way they speak. Because in Shakespeare, you are how you speak. And it's very easy for an actor to come along with an idea or a preconceived idea of what that character is, and then try and fit it onto the language. So the exploration of the language is to I have cast you in the role, so I kind of think you're going to get there. But in a way, it's about how you find who you are from how you speak and how you interact, how you share the lines with other characters, for instance. So, but also that's trying to make actors realise, which often they do instinctively anyway, that the meaning is only a small part of it. That the sound of the language, the rhetoric, the construction of the entire speech, not just phrase by phrase, but how the entire speech comes together, is really important. And often it takes a bit of bullying, drilling rather, not bullying. I didn't say bullying. Drilling to get that really into people's bodies, to make the language vivid, but to own it at the same time, I would say.
Yes. Sorry, and then I'll come to you.
Greg, I wanted to ask a general question really about the role of artistic director, because I was just reading today that Manchester Royal Exchange have abandoned their model. Having had 3 different times, they're moving away from having someone in that role. You yourself have been replaced by 2 people rather than 1. I think in the last year there's something like 10 artistic directors that have left quite high-profile posts, and in some cases haven't been replaced like for like. I just wonder whether you felt that role, as you have just shared for the last 20 years, has a future.
I hope it does. I hope it does, because it feels to me as though it's vital that the artist is in the centre of it, and it seems to me, nevertheless, that the challenge is that the job has got so fucking hard, and I'm not surprised that those people, have kind of gone enough already. A, they've just been through, a pandemic. B, they're constantly struggling with how to make the cash stretch. And I think it's a real skill, and it's a skill that we nobody taught me how to be an artistic director. I did watch some very fine people do it, from Terry Hansen, Adrian Noble, and Mike Boyd. But I think it is really challenging, and I think we need to put thought into how we support those structures so that we can have the artist at the centre of it. Because there are great facilitators, but to me, I felt that I had a very strong, specific idea about how I would shape my tenure, which was to do with following the canon. And therefore giving each play its space. But, I was also supported by some magnificent people, who made my job much easier and made me look a great deal better as a result. But it's, that without that support, and we're a big company at the RSC, without that support it's very, very difficult and very lonely. So those networks are really, really vital, and the support of those people doing those very difficult jobs is vital too.
Hi, I'm
I'm very interested in what you were saying about the importance of the lived experience as you cast people. And I spent the last 10 years before I was a student here as a trapeze artist in circuses all around the world. And I am, of course, very drawn to the grave diggers being cast as clowns at Ophelia's graveyard. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you felt that these two grave diggers debating the importance of a consecrated grave changes by the fact that they were cast, for lack of a better word, as clowns, presumably from a circus, and that they tell the audience, we have the most important job because our job lasts till doomsday.
Gosh, I'm not sure I have time to answer that question. It's a very big question, isn't it? The funnies in Shakespeare are only funny if they're truthful. And a good clown knows that at their core. So I think there's a coincidence of that. At the same time, you're also aware of, Hamlet's advice to players of don't let your clown say more than is set down for them. I did a production of Macbeth, and it lasted, the running time was either 1 hour 58 or 2 hours 7, depending on how long the porter went on for. And I had given him certain leeway. He was a very good mimic. So when it came to the equivocator, he used to do impersonations of Tony Blair. I think I'm not sure I could define quite what the skill is that's required, but I know that what you're getting at has to be something that is more than just a funny line or a laugh that you're trying to get at. There's almost always in Shakespeare a bigger truth that's going on as well. So somebody who can illuminate that is what is most important for me.
Well, with the words running to time, I feel I should hand over to the master who's going to conclude proceedings.
Thank you very much, both of you. Fantastic. Thank you very much, both of you. And with sincere apologies to those of us who are with us online, I invite you all to come outside for a drink. Thank you very much.